that folks might have for either Professor McCannon or myself. Does group one, do we remember who was in group one? Kathy's raising her hand. Okay.
Yes. We were discussing redlining, and we were wondering if redlining is still in effect, even though it's no longer legal.
Well, that's a fantastic question. So you're right that it is no longer legal. It technically was not legal even at the time. It was a violation of, you know, several Supreme Court rulings around housing equity. But the effects of that whole, everything that was institutionalized in that period of time, what it did is it created attitudes and practices that just then became the norm, right? And so while we don't necessarily have underwriting practices that say East Boston should pay more or should have fewer mortgages, those underwriting practices will still, for example, target subprime loan opportunities more towards zip codes that have predominantly people of color or low-income peoples in them. And those are just tightly embedded both in the structures of their algorithms, right? What we would, you know, the formulas that they use, but also in just the biases of the insurers themselves, right? So so this notion that, you know, you have to be careful about, from a banker's perspective, right? You want to make sure you get repaid. And so being skeptical about the ability of people of color to be able to repay, that is just baked into how they think now. And it goes back to that period of time when the FHA, you know, good intention, the intention was to expand access to mortgages, because prior to the FHA programs, you know, if you wanted to buy a house, you either had to pay for it right away, like 100%, or you had to pay 50 to 80% down payment. So the bank was only going to take a risk on 20%, right? And so prior to that, most people couldn't afford to buy a home. And so good intentions, but in doing that, they sort of overcorrected and created these biases that are now just part of the system and are going to take some time to undo. So thank you for that question. I hope that answers it.
Thank you.
Group number two. Who was group number two?
Grace will speak for group number two. Our entire group was focused on the statement of Professor McCannon, and it's something that has bothered each of us in different ways as long-term UUs, and that is, how can we do a better job bridging our spouse principles with our lived realities? Because I've watched it for years and years. Dana McLean Greeley was the minister of my first Unitarian church, and I've just not seen it. And I know the UUs have tried. So that question, and then just write down very practically, are there any examples of churches, parishes that are doing a better job with that today, 2020, circa 2020?
Yeah, so one thing that's really interesting, I'll answer the last part of that first, that the patterns that were observed in 1952 have to a certain extent persisted because people would still lift up Community Church of New York, First Unitarian of Chicago, and All Souls of DC as among the most successfully integrated congregations in Unitarian Universalism. I think we're right in the middle of a period of concerted action that includes places like the Congregation of Annapolis, that have committed to a vision similar to those congregations with a strong Black senior minister, and also, the emergence of what's happening, another thing that's happening right now is that through Black Lives of UU, we're starting to see new congregations that are specifically centering people of color emerging. And we'll see, you know, if as a movement we support those congregations better than we did the Harlem Unitarian Church. Because, you know, keep in mind that integration is not an end in itself. You know, the liberation of all people is the end. And that involves historically marginalized communities being able to freely choose, you know, to participate in integrated congregations or in congregations that truly center their distinct experiences. The other piece of this, you know, I believe passionately that we're never going to change the racial dynamics of Unitarian Universalism unless we change the class dynamics. And that's the congregation we haven't really ever put at the center of our attention.
Thank you.
Thank you. I just want to use moderator's privilege just to make one thing that I was struck by, Professor McKinnon, that you said in your description of these fellowships that we're developing is, and I think how integration required very intentional choices, right? There was an intention, there had to be very intentional actions taken. And I think that's worth reflecting on, what actions need to be taken and what are the challenges posed in taking those actions, and what do we need to get over in order to take those actions that need to be taken. So those are things worth reflecting on. Thank you so much, Group 2. Group 3.
Well, I guess I'll speak to that. I asked a question in the chat before we were told that we had to have a question, and so we ended up talking about that question. But specifically, during the period 1920 to 1960, there was a lot of the history that you described, and thank you both for telling us about history we really weren't aware of. What about the Universalists, particularly during that period when Universalists were very urban and Unitarians and Universalists were different denominations?
Yeah, I'm sorry that I didn't really say anything about that. Partly it was out of deference to the particular history of this congregation and your interest in the larger Bostonian story during a period when Universalists were very weak in the city of Boston. Nationwide, this is the time of precipitous numerical decline for Universalists. The two denominations had been roughly equal in size at the beginning of the 20th century, and they were the Universalists were much, much smaller by the time the merger took place. So there's not much of a Universalist story to tell. There was a strong Universalist ministry led by Black ministers in the town of Suffolk, Virginia, in the first couple of decades of the 20th century. But after that, I'm not really aware of much. There was a big fight actually over these issues in the denominational journal of Universalism in the 1930s, because the editor of the journal was actually quite white, overtly white supremacist, and a lot of other Universalists were not comfortable with that and tried to hold him to account. But I think as a very broad generalization, concern for racial justice among Universalists in the middle of the 20th century translated into enthusiasm for merger with the Unitarians.
That's very interesting. Thank you. That's a great question. Group 4.
Yes, hi. So we ended up discussing, John had started with a question that we all thought was pretty interesting, was how are we stacking up as a church against other churches currently when it comes to integrating the congregation? So what our current stance is compared to other churches in the area. And a few of the ones that we discussed specifically were the Arlington Street Church, who is known to have for as much as they don't have one population, they have a large population of gay community within their congregation. So, even though people can feel like they're part of the community within the church, once they leave the church, how are they then feeling integrated within the community? And what can we do as sort of a grassroots level to not just integrate the congregation, but to then have that trickle down effect? And what can we do to communicate with other churches to really spread that out into the community more? As Buzz had said too, that he had presented at the community church as well, and sort of spoke to the different flavors of the different congregations. If that came together okay and made sense. That was where the discussion went, and sort of what the question was, is kind of where are we at in comparison to other churches?
Well, I really wish I could answer that question. I'm not sure if Professor McKinnon can.
Yeah, so I don't feel, I mean, like, you'd kind of have to go from, to visit all the different churches. So I think it's a difference, if you're comparing First Church to other churches in metropolitan Boston, you might have a somewhat different answer versus if you were comparing it to UU churches nationwide. I think it's still the case that that congregations that would confidently say we've translated our aspirations into our current demographic reality, I would think it would be fewer than 10 UU congregations nationwide that say yes to that with confidence, and none in Metro Boston. Does anybody disagree with me on that point? So to compare how First Church is doing relative to Arlington Street or say First Parish Cambridge, you'd be dealing with kind of very fine shades of distinction because every place would have a long way to go.
Well, and I think it's worth also remembering that the kind of social change that we're talking about, right, the liberation of all peoples, these are generational endeavors, right? So where is your aspiration and vision? What can you do in this moment to move towards? And then how can you, in a collective sense, and your question is clearly you're thinking about this, and somebody just mentioned in the chat, GBIO being one place that you might, consider putting some energies. How do you work with others in the liberation of all peoples, right? Also remembering that the goal is to move in that direction, to continue the journey that is going to be picked up, and making sure that it can be picked up by the generation coming behind us, right?
Here's something else that's worth thinking about. As Nina's first slide showed, Boston in 1960 was 10% Black with tiny, tiny populations of all other people of color groups. So it's not that surprising that Boston Unitarianism in 1960 had not made as great strides towards integration as churches in New York, DC, and Chicago. Boston today, as we've been reminded with the upcoming mayor's race, is majority people of color. So the possibilities should be quite different today than in the period we were just talking about. Whether the actualities are that much different, that's the question for all of us to grapple with.
Thank you. Final group, group 5. Who's in group 5?
Oh, Chris, you need to unmute.
There we go. We have a familiar question related to the earlier 2 or 3. What our question sort of comes out to be, what does this information mean to us, mean for us today? in this day and age. And I think GBIO, I saw a note up in the top here from Margaret or somebody, that GBIO is a good place to start, and we are a part of GBIO for sure. But what do we form for trying to make a difference, encourage people to come or be who we are, which I think is pretty great, and inclusive. So I don't know exactly which direction we should go, and I think it's rather open at this point to have more. I mean, if we were to want to have more people of color in our congregation.
I think that is a really good transition to thinking too about, part of the assumption within a learning community is you have to know at least your past in order to understand your present.
Definitely. That was,
and to take all of that and make decisions about where to go in the future, right? Now we are entering the era of lived experience, right? A lot of us here were alive. Maybe we were small children, maybe we were not so small children during this time frame, and in the next one it'll be fully squarely within a lot of lived experiences. And I believe in the next coffee hour, and Daniel and Joanne might be able to speak to this as we close out, you'll have the opportunity to reflect on what do you understand, what does this help you understand now that maybe you folded away in the back of your mind because you didn't get it as a 13-year-old, but now, oh, okay, now that makes sense. So there'll be some opportunities to reflect also as we get to this period of lived experience for us in particular. So I think that's a fantastic way to transition to closing. So thank you, Christine, for helping us with that.
well, definitely welcoming. So that's one.
We talk about when the next session will be.
Let's go ahead and
We're still coordinating with our final panelists, so it will be later in April, but I don't know the exact date yet. So excellent question.
Or the first weekend in May. We spoke about that one too. So somewhere around then, right?
Stay tuned to your email. Yeah. One quick question before we just pivot to the close that for me, I think was very powerful with just, I had found the article, but Dr. McCannon did more to situate and research that context. And I just think about, our church today is the result of the merger of Second and First Church in the 70s. And if a board had made different decisions, 50, 60 years ago, the second church that merged with First Church would have been a different church. And who we are today would be different. Because and to me that was the heaviest thing, where it's like, these random folks who I don't know, maybe someone does, but those 10 or 12 folks who had that discussion at that time created a decision that is impacting the type of conversation that we're having today. And that's just a really heavy lived reality that everything we do, like we're writing. When someone does a presentation on the 2020s, like that's what we're writing, that chapter right now. So
for us, yeah.
that is beautiful. Thank you, Daniel.
Yes.
Who's closing for us today?
I am. So in just the spirit of memory and stories and all of these, ancestors that we recall today, we just ask that we continue to listen and learn from them, and that we can be good ancestors in our lives as we do the work of church in our time. So may you be safe, may you be happy, may you be connected. And we will have many more conversations in the time to come. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.